Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Conversations with the Dean. I'm Turney Stevens, Dean of the College of Business at Lipscomb University, and my guest today is Andrew Biggs, actually Dr. Andrew Biggs, who is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Lipscomb campus, Andrew.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're honored to have you, and we're particularly excited today to talk about your specialty, which is Social Security and the future of that. And just to establish your credentials, you are a former member of the Bush administration. You served as an associate director of the National Economic Council in the Bush White House. You're a former deputy commissioner of the Social Security Administration. That's effectively the number 2 position in the administration. And so today you spend a lot of time, I guess, just thinking about Social Security as opposed to doing Social Security, right?
Well, you should think before you do.
There you go. So let me just dive right into the key question. So is Social Security going to survive?
It'll survive. It'll survive in some form or other. The question is, what form is it going to be in? How effectively is it going to serve people going into the future, and at what cost? And those are the crucial questions for policymakers, but they're also the questions for American citizens as well. Social Security really affects people from cradle to grave. It's for your typical worker, for the typical person leaving college and entering the workforce. Social Security's payroll tax at 12.4% of your earnings, that's going to be the biggest tax you're going to pay throughout your life, more than income taxes. For retirees, Social Security is the biggest source of their retirement income, so it's crucial towards retirement security. Social Security is also the biggest program of the federal government, the biggest single budget item, and it's going broke. So you have all of those things wrapped together. It's extremely important to workers, to retirees, to the federal budget, but it faces a troubled future, and we need to think as policymakers and as citizens of how we're going to address these challenges going forward.
Now, you just said that Social Security is going broke. And of course, we hear a lot from politicians who are long on rhetoric, sometimes short on facts. We hear a lot from politicians about the fact that Social Security is in trouble. We hear about Medicare being in trouble. What are the facts? How broke is Social Security, or how broke will it be?
Well, I think it's important to start, when people say it's going broke or going bankrupt or going insolvent, that doesn't mean that future retirees will get zero. Bankrupt means, the inability to meet your obligations with the assets that you have, and that is a characterization of Social Security where it's going to be going into the future. A typical person retiring in the future under current law will only get around 80% of what they've been promised after the trust fund runs out in the mid-2030s. What Social Security promises to begin with is not a particularly generous benefit. If we don't act, if we don't get on top of this problem, they're not even going to get that. So we need to find ways, slowly but surely, to address these things. The real challenges Social Security faces are demographic. That Social Security is a pay-as-you-go program that imposes a tax on workers and immediately transfers that money to retirees and to other beneficiaries of the program. There's no account with your name on it. There's no real investment going on with Social Security. The problem with that kind of transfer, pay-as-you-go program is it's extremely sensitive to demographics. It's extremely sensitive to the number of workers paying into Social Security relative to the number of people collecting benefits. Back when the program started, there was no problems on that front. Even in 1950, which is 15 years after Social Security started, there were 16 workers paying in for every beneficiary collecting out of it. Today, there's 3 workers per beneficiary. Going into the future, it'll only be about 2 to 1. 2 workers per beneficiary is a lot bigger burden on each worker than when you have 16 workers. So that's the challenge we face. How do we pay the benefits that we've promised without unduly burdening the workforce, without hurting the economy in the process? That's going to be a very, very tough puzzle to solve.
So I think I remember in the 2000 election, I guess it was, when Al Gore talked about the lockbox. So you're telling me that there is no lockbox.
Well, the Social Security does have a trust fund, and it's important to distinguish what the trust fund is and what it isn't. When Social Security runs a surplus in any given year, when it collects more in payroll taxes than it needs to pay out in benefits, that surplus is credited to the trust fund. The trust fund holds special issue, non-tradable government bonds. They pay a market rate of interest. They are backed by the full faith and credit of the government. So they are an asset to Social Security. What people don't realize is they're an equal and opposite liability to the rest of the government, meaning to the taxpayer. So if the taxpayer says, well, I don't have to worry about Social Security or Social Security's financing because there's the trust fund to pay it, what he doesn't realize is he's the guy who has to repay the trust fund. Going into the future, we have to pay full benefits, we have to raise taxes or cut spending in order to balance the program. Those choices exist whether we have a trust fund or whether we don't have a trust fund. It's an accounting entity. It has some legal significance. Most economists think it has very little economic significance. It doesn't truly help us pre-fund these benefits in order to reduce the burden on future workers. It just doesn't have that kind of importance at all.
Now, most people probably don't realize it, but there is a board of trustees for the Social Security Administration. There's also a board of trustees for the Medicare fund as well. And the annual report, which the trustees are required by law to file with Congress, is available. I won't say readily available, but it is posted on the internet, and it is possible to read that. And it is without all the rhetoric of the politicians. And so tell me what the trustees are currently predicting about the near future and perhaps even the longer future of Social Security.
Well, I was actually very involved with that process of constructing the trustees report during my time at the Social Security Administration in my job as what you call the secretary to the board of trustees. But the more important part was running the policy office where folks from Social Security and other agencies would come together and look at what's going on with the program, trying to project what's going to happen to the system over time. Now, those projections are uncertain. We can't know what the future is going to be. We can't know, for instance, exactly how long people are going to live. We can't know exactly how quickly the economy is going to grow. But one of the interesting things that we can do is that long-term trends are in a way easier to predict than short-term trends. I can't tell you what the weather tomorrow is going to be, but I can tell you that 6 months from now, it's going to be warmer than it is today. So those long-term trends that we see evolving over a fairly long period are fairly easy to predict and understand. And those trends are lower birth rates, which means fewer new workers coming into the labor force, fewer new workers paying into Social Security. We also see increasing lifespans. That means more people surviving to retirement age, more people are living longer after retirement. So that increases the cost of the system. What the trustees project is that the Social Security Trust Fund, which, as we mentioned, is sort of an accounting entity, that should be sufficient or solvent through the mid-2030s. In the last trustees report, they projected it'll be solvent through around the year 2037. It's likely this next year they will push that date forward. Over the long term, the system faces unfunded liabilities, meaning benefits in excess of the taxes that it will collect of somewhere around $15 trillion. So it's a significant shortfall. If we wanted to balance the system going forward, one way of thinking about it is we could have an immediate and permanent tax increase from 12.4% of payroll today to somewhere around 14.5% of pay. Alternately, we could have an immediate and permanent benefit cut of somewhere around 15 or 20%. If we delay those changes, they simply get larger. So even if we made the smallest possible changes to make the system solvent by acting today, those changes will be pretty significant. If we delay, it gets tougher and tougher to do. And the trustees are, now they are generally appointees of the Obama administration. They're Secretary of the Treasury, of Health and Human Services, Labor, and the Social Security Administration, along with 2 public trustees. But they say the same things that the trustees did under the Bush administration. They say the shortfalls facing Social Security are significant, and the sooner we act, the less jarring, the less difficult those choices for reform are going to be. So there's really a remarkable amount of uniformity between the political parties when it comes to the problems facing Social Security. Trustees of both parties find essentially the same thing. The system can pay benefits today, but going forward into the future, the shortfalls are pretty significant, and we have to do something to get on top of them.
Well, I want to talk about your experience in the Bush administration and the proposals that were made during those years to privatize Social Security. But before we do that, let's talk about the origins of Social Security just for a moment. It's a bit of a misnomer for us to talk exclusively about this being a retirement program, because in reality, it's also a disability benefits program and a death benefits program. So perhaps you could walk us through not so much the history of Social Security, although that might be somewhat interesting to our viewers, but also the comprehensive nature of the programs and how much of the problem does retirement represent versus disability benefits or death benefits.
Well, Social Security program, the Social Security Act was passed in 1935. There had been sort of movement in the United States to have some sort of social insurance or pension program for several decades prior to that. And several other countries had already passed programs similar to Social Security. We were a bit of a laggard in that respect, in part because of the sort of constitutional views, where it was really very questionable during the 1930s whether a program like Social Security would be viewed as a constitutional prerogative of the federal government. It's similar to the legal cases going through today regarding the health care mandate passed under the Obamacare health reform. That's going through the Supreme Court. Back in the 1930s, when Social Security passed, there was a Supreme Court case as well, asking whether the federal government has the authority to run a program like this. Eventually, this is, for those who remember their high school history, this brings you back to the attempt by President Roosevelt to pack the Supreme Court, to sort of intimidate it. And one of the upshots of that was that the court was intimidated and they ruled that the Social Security Act was constitutional, whereas prior to that it was assumed that they might not do that. When Social Security started, it was actually it was a fairly limited program. It didn't offer disability benefits or survivors benefits or spousal benefits. It was really more restricted to the pension end of things. Alongside the pension end, the Social Security Act included unemployment benefits and some grants to the states to help them during the Depression. One thing people don't know is the Social Security was passed in the mid-1930s during the Depression, but the benefits were not paid until the Depression was over in 1940. But over time, beginning in 1950, disability benefits were added, survivors benefits, spousal benefits have been added earlier than that. So a program that started fairly modestly grew over time. And this is a familiar story for people who look at other government programs, but it was not clear at the time Social Security is passed it would be the largest program in the federal government. The tax to pay for benefits was 2% of people's earnings. Today it's 12.4%. So you see an evolution of programs over time. And that Social Security has become a much larger program than people originally envisioned. The disability program has grown significantly over time. Social Security, the retirement portion, the costs are driven almost entirely by population aging, of how many people are paying in, how many people are collecting out. The disability program has all of those problems, but it also has an increase in disability rates that occurred since the mid-1980s. Back at that time, the Reagan administration had cracked down a bit on disability and thrown some people off the rolls. There was a backlash in Congress where they loosened eligibility rules for disability so that disability rolls have really skyrocketed. And that's yet another challenge that policymakers have to face. How do you make this program help the people who are truly disabled while also preventing it from becoming what it is in many European countries, where it's essentially a long-term unemployment program or an early retirement program. And I think there's some hope for bipartisan action on that, of really providing better incentives for employers to keep disabled workers on the job, which is good for the workers and good for Social Security. But you're entirely correct that what you start out with in 1935 is very different in a way than what you end up with.
Well, I think it's also true that Social Security has eroded earnings perhaps more than might immediately be apparent, because the rate at which earnings are withheld may have gone up only to, what did you say a minute ago, 12%?
12.4%.
Starting at, what, 2%? but the earnings subject to that withholding have increased significantly just in my working.
Sure.
In my work. So the effective tax rate is really significantly high.
When Social Security started, the tax rate was 2% of earnings up to $3,000. Today, it's 12.4% of earnings up to $106,800. Now, granted, in the past, you had to adjust for inflation and things like that. But clearly, Social Security, the tax burden on individuals and on the economy has grown, and the question is, how do you reconcile that? That when the program started, we could pay relatively generous benefits to rich and poor alike at low tax rates because we had such favorable demographics. We don't have that anymore, and so those three things together of the level of benefits, the universality of benefits, that it's not a means-tested welfare program, and the relatively low payroll tax rates, those three promises can't all be kept. Just mathematically, they can't. Politicians are very, very bad at saying that, well, what you were promised before, we're going to have to change the rules of the game. But that's simply what they have to do. And it's up to the public to determine how they want to change those rules. Do they want to raise taxes beyond historical levels in order to keep the benefits flowing? Do they want to cut benefits back for high-income people, either by means testing or other reforms? Do they want to make benefits less generous? There's these trade-offs we have to make. But you can't start making those trade-offs until your elected officials become very clear in saying, look, the rules of the game, we promised you something we can't sustain, and we have to change that.
But nobody's willing to say that.
Some are. I mean, I think President Bush did a pretty good job of trying to get on top of this in the sense that he proposed reducing the growth of benefits for higher income retirees. So he said, the bottom third of retirees, the people who really depend on the system the most, they're going to get everything they've been promised going forward. Current retirees wouldn't be affected. But he said, look, people who are middle income and higher income, they're going to have to get a reduced benefit than what they've been promised. And the idea there was to help Social Security concentrate on the people who need it the most while living within its means. But he also proposed personal accounts for Social Security. They were very controversial, and the combination of the two, of cutting benefits and having controversial accounts and a healthy dose of politics, meant it was just very, very hard to pass that.
Well, I promised to come back to the Bush administration, so that's a good segue to come back to that subject. Now, leaving aside, Andrew, all of the rhetoric and all the politicians' statements about what they think we should do or not do, you're an expert in the subject. Should we privatize Social Security?
Well, I think Social Security should have more of a market element to it, or more of an individual responsibility element. I mean, Social Security kind of does two things. On one hand, it acts as something like a welfare program where it redistributes to low-income people and helps people who, even if they saved responsibly throughout their lives, they couldn't afford to provide a decent lifestyle in retirement. So in that sense, it acts a little bit like a welfare program. But for the rest of us, it acts much like a forced savings program. For middle and high-income people, it simply says, you have to pay money into this system while you're working, you're going to get money back later. That means, in a sense, the system is bigger than it needs to be. And it also means that a lot of people who really could and should be saving on their own through private retirement accounts that would be good for them, that would improve national saving, instead they're relying on this transfer program from Social Security. So I think we need to sort of dissect the way the benefits work a bit and say, look, Social Security is going to focus a little bit more on helping the people who really need it the most, but the people who aren't poor, the middle and high income folks, they're going to have to save more. And so there's no free lunch in this sense of just taking your money, putting it in a personal account, and it's going to make you rich. But it is saying that the program we need more self-reliance and more saving among middle and high income people. If they all saved the way they needed to, say by automatically signing them up for 401ks, Social Security's job would be so much easier because it wouldn't have to serve them as much. It could focus on the low income folks. So I don't think it's really necessarily a question of privatization versus non-privatization. It's not a question of investing in stocks is going to rescue us. I mean, stocks pay higher returns because they have higher risk, and not just finance stuff. But it's really a question of what is the system going to look like? And a system designed for the world of 1935 is probably not the best system for people retiring in 2035 and beyond. when Social Security started, there was no mutual funds, there was no internet. People they couldn't save on their own in the same way they can today. If we want people to save on their own, the best way to do it is just simply sign them up for pensions and let individuals in the private sector do what they do best, while the government does what it does best, which is the redistributive element of it. So it's really just re-envisioning what this program should do and what it should look like.
Well, you live in Washington and you work in Washington. You walk the hallways of Congress. You've worked in the Social Security Administration. You must have talked to a lot of senators and Congress people about Social Security. When the cameras are turned off and when all the rhetoric can be laid aside, what's the critical mass thinking about what the future of Social Security should be? Does it match what you just laid out?
Well, I think they basically understand it. Social Security can be a fairly technical program. Your typical member of Congress didn't get elected to work on Social Security or even any specific program. So sometimes the level of knowledge isn't incredibly good. They don't understand exactly how the financing works, the benefits, or anything like that. But I think they have a basic idea that the terms of the agreement have to be changed, that what we promised can't be fulfilled, so we have to renegotiate that deal. At the same time, though, they're scared. And you see it, some are just scared into inaction. They know we have to do something, but they just don't want to deal with the angry letters and phone calls and emails and getting voted out of office, because once you're in Congress, that's a huge, it becomes part of what a person is. And nobody wants to be rejected. But so a lot of the problem that people blame it on members of Congress, they say, oh, they have no courage. Part of the problem is that members of Congress who do show courage sometimes get voted out of office. So it's not just the congressmen, it's the people as well. So some of them are just afraid to do anything. Others want to do something, but they can't quite sort of grasp the bull by the horns and take it on. I tend to think that the way to go on something like this is similar to the way Congressman Paul Ryan has done, where he's simply said, in for a penny, in for a pound. If I'm going to do this, I'm just going to do it. And I'm going to embrace reform, I'm going to lay it out for people, and I'm going to inform myself and essentially go whole hog in explaining and defending things. This is you can't be half pregnant on this. That if you're going to do it at all, you really have to get involved and be willing to explain it and defend it to people. Some members of Congress can do that, a lot can't. And the reason why reform gets delayed so much, we've known for decades we need to fix this system, but they can't bring themselves to do it because they're scared. And anybody who goes out and does it and proposes it, it's so easy to undercut them, to attack them, to score some political points. In U.S. politics and U.S. government, when it comes to Social Security or entitlements in general, to use a sports metaphor, it's much easier to play defense than offense. That the team that wants to prevent something from happening has a much easier time than the team who wants to make something happen. In most other countries, you have parliamentary democracies, it's the other way around. If you're the party in power, you could make things happen. In the U.S., where things have to pass the House and the Senate has a supermajority, then it has to go to the president. It's real tough to do these things. I mean, if you see the difficulties that President Obama had passing health care reform, even though he had large majorities in Congress, it's very hard to get something through. And I think that's just been a real problem for us.
Let's change the focus of our discussion in the few minutes that we have remaining. You talked a few minutes ago about the origins of the program in 1935. You talked about the expansion of the program in the 50s. What we saw in this country after World War II was a redefinition of the concept of what you do with your life after about age 65. And retirement became a cultural phenomenon in this country. At age 65, you were entitled to quit your job and to live a life of leisure. Do you see that changing culturally in this country?
I think slowly but surely it will, but we have got a long way to go to recover to where we were before. If you go back to 1950, the typical person didn't claim Social Security benefits until age 68, and those folks would live to somewhere around 76. You had about 8 years of benefit receipt. Today, a typical person claims Social Security at age 62 or 63. They can expect to live into their early 80s. So that's about 20 years of receiving benefits. So we're living longer, but we're retiring earlier. And it's really hard to argue we can't work a little bit longer. Those people back in 1950, they weren't working office jobs where you might get carpal tunnel from the mouse in your computer. They were working in factories and coal mines and farms. Today, there are clearly people who can't work longer. And there are people with physically demanding jobs or disabilities, and they can't work to 65 or 70. But it just seems implausible to me to say we can't work a little bit longer. If we didn't have Social Security setting the expectations of when people would retire, of saying, okay, 62 is when you can get benefits, or 65 is when you get full benefits, or however they want to think about it. As life expectancies increased, people would naturally divide that increase, a little bit in terms of longer retirements and a little bit in terms of longer working lives. That's just a natural thing that economists would say people would do on their own. What Social Security has done by setting people's expectations that come age 62, you're out of the workforce, is it is prevented people from that natural evolution that longer lifespans should mean longer working lives. And so it's not, Social Security is seen as a financing problem or trust funds and all that. In a sense, it's kind of a labor force participation problem, that what was a pension plan for the truly old has become a plan for the late middle-aged. And we can't afford that. Or at least we can't afford it on the taxes people are willing to pay. If people are willing to pay for that, then that's fine. But I suspect that when the choice comes, people are willing to work a little bit longer, save a little bit more on their own in order to have Social Security remain kind of a robust safety net. But that's going to demand people to make some tough choices. And that's what the political process is, and that's why you need leadership.
Now, I assume as a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, you think about these types of things. Social policy, I would assume, would be a part of your daily existence. And I think I'm correct in saying that there are about 10,000 people a day turning age 65, and that's going to continue for the next 19 years. And so why don't we establish social policy in this country that encourages people to work longer? Why don't we tell a person 65 years of age, if you'll start a new business, we'll provide total tax relief on the earnings from that business as long as you continue to work? Why don't we fix the problem by being positive as opposed to negative?
Well, one of the proposals I've made actually is similar to that. It would, from age 62 on, the Social Security payroll tax would be eliminated. And one reason for that is the way Social Security's benefit formula works. The typical person is age 62 who says, I'm going to delay retirement and pay into Social Security for an extra year. They're getting next to no benefits back for what they pay. For each dollar of additional taxes that a near retiree pays, they get something like 2 cents back in extra benefits. It's just not worth it to them. By eliminating the payroll tax for older workers, you're getting rid of that distortion. And older workers are also the most sensitive to tax rates. So the estimates I've done is that's a tax cut that could almost pay for itself, because the sensitivity to taxes is high among older workers, and they really would respond by working longer. That's good for them, that's good for Social Security, that's good for the economy as a whole, because we need more workers. So I think we need some fairly aggressive, some fairly imaginative ways of telling people, we want you to work longer, and we want to give you tools that enable you to work longer. That work is going to look a lot more attractive to somebody if you're getting rid of that 12.5% payroll tax than if you don't. And so I think there's ways we can do this, but we need to get out of the box a little bit and think a little bit more imaginatively about things.
Well, we've got time for one more question, so let me ask you one last question that's out of the box. How is that? We've heard a few people on the fringes talk about the fact that, well, if there are 2 workers for every 1 person claiming benefits, we need more people paying in. And so there are a few people out there that are saying, well, gee, we ought to merge with Canada, or we ought to merge with Mexico. Does that make any sense?
Well, higher immigration, which is effectively what you'd be doing, is proposed as a way to help Social Security's financing. I guess I have 2 answers to that question. One is something like immigration policy is such an important thing that it should not, you should not let Social Security's priorities determine that. If you look at what's going on in Europe, where they had similar issues to us, and they essentially had a large influx of immigrants who are now having problems assimilating. So I think Social Security or immigration is too important to be determined by Social Security alone. But there's a kind of a technical problem there, particularly if you're thinking about immigration from Mexico or Latin America, which is, on average, lower income people receive more in benefits from Social Security than they pay in taxes. So letting more immigrants in will make the system look financially better today because you've got the folks' taxes today, but you're going to owe them benefits in the future that exceed the value of their taxes. If you've got an underfunded pension system, bringing in more participants who are essentially going to be money losers to the system probably isn't going to work very well. But I think it makes sense to think about these big picture things. So that's a proposal I don't think works in a mechanical sense, but I think thinking big picture about how do we address these issues, because it's not just the financing of a system, it's how do we address the larger aging of the population, of how do we make it so that smaller groups, smaller populations of workers can support economically larger populations of retirees. That's a challenge that goes beyond Social Security taxes and benefits to the general economic environment that we want to have. So there's a lot of things we could do to help fix these things, but again, people need to think imaginatively about it.
Well, Andrew, it's been great to have you here on the program today, and thank you for being on the Lipscomb campus. It's an honor to have you.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's been a pleasure.
Please come back again soon. My guest today has been Dr. Andrew Biggs, who is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He's been on campus today speaking to our students, and we've been honored to have him talk with us today about Social Security. I hope you'll join us again soon for Conversations with the Dean.